Well, hello and welcome to another Monday night Q&A. I'm joined by my colleague Dan Smith, head of our assessment team. Good evening, Dan.
Hey Sam, how you doing?
I'm good. How's your Monday been so far?
Do you know what? It's been good. I've been out and about today. I've been out in London, which is always good just to get out. I love hybrid working, but I do like to see people face to face. So no, I'm buzzing today as a result. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I think it's the point. It's nice to get that balance, isn't it? Get that time alone when you can get your head down and get some stuff done. But yeah, it is a people role, and we do need to speak to people, definitely.
We do. It's good to be engaged. Always good to be engaged.
Yeah, it checks our sanity as well, because sometimes we just have to say, is it right that? Yeah, so we definitely do need that second head.
Definitely.
Okay, just to for those that may not be familiar with our role and what we do on a Monday night. So as with all of our live Q&A sessions, just run through a few house rules. So we start off with the question of the week that was posted out on social media earlier today, and we'll look at the question and give you our thoughts on the proposed answer with some rationale behind that. And then while we're giving you some time to put your questions into the chat, we'll go through some of the questions that were held over from last time. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I know that some of you have already put those in, so that's brilliant. Keep firing those questions in and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Remember always that there's no such thing as a stupid question, only stupid answers, and please remember to be respectful to each other in the chat. You know, the whole idea of this evening is that collectively we want to help each other with the aim of improving all of our collective knowledge and understanding, because I'm sure that there's something that I'm going to learn from this evening that somebody says, and that should be the mindset that we all go in with it. So great. So let's just have a look at what our question of the week was. So question of the week this week was around current carrying capacity, and when we come to find out what our current carrying capacity of our cable is for compliance with 433.1.1 ident 3, what's the maximum IZ value for the lowest rated conductor of a circuit protected by a BS3036 fuse? So BS3036 fuse, quite commonly termed as rewirables. So we gave you four options. Is it 0.5 times the nominal rated value, 0.725 times the nominal rated value? Is it 1 times the nominal rated value, or is it 1.5 times the nominal rated value? And when I looked at the polls earlier today, we had 70% of the people with the right answer, which was good to see, and that right answer is 0.725 times the rated value. And if we just go through a little bit of information as to why that is, well, if we look within BS7671 itself, firstly we'd be driven by Reg 433.1.202, which says where our protective device is a semi-enclosed fuse to 3036, then in order to meet ident 3 of regulation 433.1.1, it's afforded if the rated current does not exceed 0.725 times the current carrying capacity of the cable IZ of the lowest rated conductor in the circuit protected. So it is a little bit different. If you look in that section for current carrying capacity and overcurrent protection, quite often we look at that value of 1.45 the rated value of our overcurrent protective device to make sure that the cables will be capable of carrying that current. So a little bit of background very briefly. Why do we think it's 0.725? And really that's to do with the fact that BS3036's fuses are a little bit different from most of the other overcurrent protective devices. So if we look at most of the overcurrent protective devices, so BS88 type fuses, 60898 circuit breakers, and also 60947-2 circuit breakers, 61009 RCBOs. All of those have got a value of 1.45 times the IN, because all of those types of protective devices, the effective current to result in operation of those devices, or as it's referred to, the current required to cause effective operation, is based on 1.45 times the rated value. But a BS3036 fuse, a rewirable fuse, is slightly different in that it's 2 times IN. So you've got that extra factor in, and so if you look at 1.45 divided by 2, that's where we get our value of 0.725. And you notice that information's actually in 7671, isn't it, Dan, in the appendix?
Yes, in Appendix 4, section under overload protection, it sort of touches on that, to be fair, and it sort of went about sizing conductors, protection against overload using a rewirable BS3036 fuse, and it sort of talks about that factor rating of 1.45 divided by 2 equaling the 0.725. So it is actually in the regs, and so you can find further guidance in the Appendix 4 on, I think it's on page 424 of the original brown cover book.
Yeah, but it's what it boils down to is, if you have a look, we'll just very quickly show you. So these are the time curves for 3036 fuses, and you can see that for our 5 amp fuse, even with a fault current of 10 amps, i.e. twice the rated value, it's taking something like 80 seconds for that fuse to operate. And if you go to the top of the curves, the top of those curves are approximately at twice the IN rating. That's the current needed to actually cause the fuses to operate. And if you do go back and look at those time curves for things like BS88 fuses and 60898 breakers, you'll see that those curves start at a value of 1.45. So it's all about the slight difference in that, and that has to be factored in when we're using a 3036 fuse, that we know it's not going to operate as quickly as those other devices based on the same fault current, and therefore our current carrying capacity of our cables has to be greater. Anything you'd add to that, Dan?
No, I think you covered it well. I think the main emphasis is that it's all to do with what current is required to cause that effective operation and how it differs from other protective devices. And I say that when you do the calculation 1.45 divided by 2, that's where it all originates from. And that is really the key words. It's all to do with the current required to cause that effective operation. Right.
Okay, we'll pick up a few of the questions that were hanging over. So first one is, and this is a common one that we get to the technical helpline, can the conductors of an AC circuit enter a steel enclosure through a brass plate without it being slotted? So without the brass plate being slotted. So do we need to slot a brass plate, Dan?
So no, we don't. To be fair, brass is not ferromagnetic material, and you often see brass, other non-ferromagnetic materials such as different grades of aluminium or Paxoline, for example, or toughened plastic as well. I've seen all sorts. You often find it mainly when you've got like your larger single pole conductors. From a generator enclosure, for example, could be an example of that, where you have got these other non-ferromagnetic materials, to obviously to mitigate those effects of what we know as eddy currents or ferromagnetic effects now. You can use. You have to slot it. You can use brass, is absolutely fine. And I think when we sort of look at that and the regulation, just touching on that 52151 of the BS771 to ferromagnetic enclosure and the electromagnetic effects. This again sort of reinforces that about if you haven't got those AC circuit, the line conductors and the neutral, and if any protective conductor that's appropriate, it should be collectively surrounded by that same material. But I say that's because it is ferromagnetic. But when it's things like brass, it doesn't count. So, and I say you would see this commonly, a lot of big industrial commercial installations where this has actually been used as well. And if it was on an assessment, and obviously we saw, sort of touching on loosely to it, but separate like line neutral conductors into a ferromagnetic enclosure, we would raise that obviously as a departure and as a non-conformance as a result. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So brass isn't ferromagnetic. You know that magnetic field generated by the conductors isn't going to create a field within that brass material because it's not ferromagnetic. So that's okay. And yeah, just showing some slides to show that if it were a steel in structure, steel being ferromagnetic would need to be slotted to reduce the effect of those eddy currents that are created. Another one that's held over is, again, another classic to the helpline. How far apart do two items have to be before they're considered not simultaneously accessible? Because we've got a lot of situations where we're not allowed to have two items that could be of a different potential, a different earthing system, simultaneously accessible. So what's our guidelines on distances required to prevent simultaneous accessibility?
So for this one, we want to go over to regulation 417.3 under the section of placing out of reach. And you'll see a distance there, which is commonly cited, often referred to as 2.5 metres. And with that, that is deemed, if it's over that, it's not deemed within arm's reach. It's the 2.5 metres. So that's the key distance there.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. And that's roughly, if you extend both arms out, it's effectively hand to hand, isn't it, with both arms extended in opposite directions. That's roughly where they get that 2.5 measurement from. Okay, another one, for compliance with 7671, do I need to test AFDDs?
So functional testing, you'll find that under regulation 643.10. And where an AFDD is installed, the effectiveness of any manual operated test facility, on that device shall be verified, but in accordance with the manufacturing instructions again. So, and again, talking about functional testing as well, that doesn't replace the functional test indicated by the relevant standards. And I say, often you'll find AFDs built in with RCCBs or RCBOs. And again, they often have a test facility on there that does have to be tested. I say where that manual test facility has been provided. So as I say, but there's no other testing that's required on the regs, but you have got that reference to functional testing. And again, it's where that device, the AFDD, does have that manual test facility.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about there's no, the devices themselves have got integral test functionality that effectively they run periodically themselves and on startup, but there's not always a manual test button available. One more before we start to look at some of the ones coming on the field, and again this is a common one to the helpline. So in a TT installation, do I need to protect the incoming tails to a metal distribution board with 100 milliamp RCD? So again, a common question, do I need an upfront RCD on a TT installation?
But in short, no, but I will go to regulation. It's one of them lovely long regulations. It rolls off the tongue. 531.3.5.3.2.201. So we got there eventually. And I say, and that, particular regulation can be found on page 158 of the regs. But basically, the reason why is, if you've got that class 1 enclosure in a TT system, it's all about the methods of protection of double and reinforced installation. So if you have got those double and reinforced, meter tails, for example, and they're coming to the enclosure, the outer sheath isn't cut back, it's going, straight into the incoming device, etc. You have got, and that will protect you for basic and fault protection, that part of the installation, and that's why an RCD isn't required if you have got that measure. And there is actually a note in that that does read, for class 1 enclosures in TT systems where the RC protection is used on outgoing circuits, double or reinforced installation of all live conductors, the incoming cables, extension terms, etc. On the supply side of the incoming device, is your main switch, etc., shall be used. Insulated and non-metallic sheath cables are deemed to meet the requirements of double or reinforced installation. That's where we go. But if you go back further, you can look at regulation 410.3.3, for example. We talked about the 4 protection measures, that each part of the installation should have one or more of, and indent 2 is double reinforced installation, which can be found further in section 412. And there we'll just sort of cite that basic installation is provided by that basic installation, and fault protection is provided by the supplementary installation, or basic and fault is provided by the reinforced installation between the live parts and accessible parts. So you can see that the relation. So because you've got that installation method at that part of the installation, that will omit the need for having the RCD there. But obviously, if that wasn't there, then yeah, you might be looking at the RCD upfront protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's all about the fact that if we can rely on that double insulation, it needs to be maintained until the tails are inside the enclosure. And there are also a couple of notes about ensuring that the manufacturer of the distribution board or consumer unit, that you use their equipment, you're not making up cables internally, etc., and that the manufacturer approves those internal interconnections. So yeah, it's possible. And I was always taught about the fact that we don't really want that upfront RCD, because effectively that can create your single point of failure. And if you look at division of installation, that tells us we should try and minimise that. Obviously, there are some instances where you can't avoid it, but where you can, and this would be a good one, you could avoid it by having double insulated tails. Okay, I'm really pleased to say we've got some great questions, so we'll have a look at those questions that have come in through the chat. So first one in was from engineer Rick Jones. So great question. Does an AED enclosed defib unit need a dedicated circuit? So does an automated external defibrillator need a dedicated circuit? It's a good question, and we're seeing them, thankfully, we're seeing them more and more, especially around sort of communal buildings like sports centres, etc., on the outside of those buildings for use by the public. We'll get Dan's thoughts on this in a minute, but my first thought there's nothing in 7671 which specifically says it needs to be on a dedicated circuit. However, because you might want to ensure that it is supplied and the batteries are charged, you might consider putting it on a dedicated circuit so nothing else could cause a fault whereby you're going to lose the supply to that circuit. So 7671 doesn't ask for it specifically, but I think in terms of a design consideration, it would certainly be a great design consideration, obviously providing that you've got the ability to have a dedicated circuit. So that would be my thoughts, that it's not a requirement for compliance with 7671, but it would certainly be a design consideration based on ensuring that you've got a consistent supply to that device so that it's functional when it's needed. Would any other thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, I think for me, just breaking into two, the two that just comes to the top of my head is one, totally right, maintaining that supply, integrity of the supply 100%. And I think if you can design it in that you mitigate, any sort of nuisance tripping, whether that taking that circuit out, etc., that you got your dedicated supply, that's a good idea. But also, again, referring to manufacturing instructions as you always do, Sam, as well, I think is always a good shout. If there's a specific requirement within that, obviously, then you go then they're going that route. But I think even without the manufacturing instructions, I would like to ensure that supply is maintained and that there's minimal risk of that being disrupted, shall we say, in normal use. So yeah,
I think you'd do everything you could to ensure continuity of supply, wouldn't you? And so that would be best done with a dedicated circuit. But yeah, it's a great question, because it's not considered in 7671 as something. So yeah, there's nothing specifically that requests it, but there's nothing to prevent you from putting it on a dedicated circuit also. The next one from another engineer that's coming tonight, Thomas Daly. Hi, if electrical insulation was installed within a domestic dwelling when the 17th edition applied, however a gas bond was not installed at the time, is one still required? And then the second part, even if it's a non-metallic service pipe to the gas meter. So I think there's kind of two parts to that. The first one would be, is it an extraneous part, that the gas service coming in? Because if it's not, i.e. it might be a plastic pipe, then it doesn't, it doesn't meet the requirements of an extraneous conductive part, and therefore wouldn't need to be bonded. So that's it. Going back to the first part of the question, if it truly were an extraneous conductive part and it hadn't been installed, if you were then doing additions or alterations that relied on the equipotential bonding, and you were using ADS, then you would need to consider adding it if it had been omitted incorrectly in the first place. But the second part of the question kind of leads me to think that it's not an extraneous conductive part if it's a plastic incoming pipe. So if it is not extraneous, then you wouldn't need to bond plastic pipe. You might also want to consider elsewhere in the installation, because if you've got gas pipe work within the installation which is conductive, so you've got copper pipe, if some of that dives into the ground for transmission of the gas service along the ground floor, then you would need to consider bonding those pipework where that re-emerges, because they would be considered extraneous. So yeah, if it's not extraneous, it doesn't need to be bonded, but some investigation would be really required to confirm that it's not extraneous, would be my thoughts. What do you think to that, Dan?
Yeah, it all comes down to if it's extraneous or not. If it's extraneous, you need to do it regardless, and if it's not, then you don't. It's not really about now, is it about the regulation changing over? It's about, is it extraneous? And I've referred to probably 314.16. Again, whenever you additions, alterations, etc., make sure that the existing, arrangements are adequate. So yeah, so for me, it all comes down to, forget about if it's on the 17th or 18th, is it extraneous or not? Yeah. What it comes down to.
Okay, got one from an engineer, Jake Hardcastle. So quite a long one, but we'll read through it and we'll try and work through it. So when you have a situation where maximum ZS is very low, what are the methods of complying? Take an installation with a 200 amp BSA 88 fuse, switch fuse supplying a dB, for example, which is a max ZS of 0.27, I think. Say ZE to the building is like 0.28. What would be the best option in this type of scenario? Same with the D. It's given another example of a type D 63 amp MCB. So if we do it on the generic that we've got a very low ZS because we've got a very high current rating protective device, but we might be a little bit away from our origin, so our incoming ZE is already higher than the rating of the protective device. We have got a solution, haven't we, Dan? And it's expressed. I'm just going to find the section, because this does happen, especially on larger plants, where because of the rating of the incoming device, you've got a very high rated overcurrent protective device, which effectively means you've got a very low ZS to achieve, and there will be instances where you just can't achieve that ZS. So 7671 then does draw you to, and I think it's 419. You'll tell me if am I in the right? Yes.
I was going to 415, but then you said 419. You're right.
Yeah, section 419, Jake, is for those particular instances where, because of your location or because of the high current rating and the low ZS to achieve, or a combination of the two, there's no way that you can achieve the maximum ZS of that overcurrent protective device at the origin. In those instances, what you have to do is, in the intake room, you have to apply equipotential bonding to all of the accessible conductive and extraneous and exposed conductive parts within that area, to ensure that your overcurrent protective device will eventually operate under fault conditions. It just won't operate quickly enough to achieve the disconnection time, because you can't achieve the ZS. So what you've got to do is, while you give it time to operate, you've got to ensure that everything in that intake area, normally it will be a dedicated intake room when you've got a supply of that size, is equipotentially bonded together so that there's no risk of the users of that installation coming into contact with that fault current for a long period of time. So the equipotential bonding will ensure that you can't simultaneously access two different things until the protective device operates. And then your outgoing circuits from that intake area should be a lower current rating, and then you'll have overcurrent protective devices which have got a reflected higher ZS, which will probably be achievable. So that's what you need to do. Have a look at section 419, which is on page 83 of the Amendment 2 book, because that section is specifically for situations like this where we can't achieve the ZS because of the characteristics of the supply, including the distance from our origin and the overcurrent protective device. Any thoughts or experiences along them lines, Dan?
Yeah, working in very large switch rooms of 2 MVA substation transformers, where it is extremely low, you've got very high fault currents available. You often see this, and you often see the bonding everywhere. Sometimes you're bonding everywhere within that switch room, but it's usually a switch room of its own, with its own big switch panels in there, should I say? And you got your single core, sort of 630mm cables coming in over the top, and you'll often see this sort of arrangement because of that reason. It's because of it's so close to the origin. It's got such a large substation transformer there. The impedance is very low. The cables are so large, which makes it even less. Obviously, which drops the ZS even less. So he's seen quite a lot.
It tends to be. I've come across it in the larger installations. So factories where you've got hundreds of amps in the supply, and so you almost can't meet your ZS due to the ZE. ZE is higher than the maximum ZS for your permitted overcurrent protective devices. So it is quite a common occurrence in those larger installations. Another one, I think from the same engineer, so he's obviously testing us tonight, Jake. So when carrying out an EICR on the 16th edition install, should we be failing domestic lighting circuits with no RCD? Are we doing a periodic to today's regs or to the regs that it was installed to? So that's a sort of separate question. Maybe we can answer that one first. And he hears a lot of opinions on this. A lot of young sparks will not know what was allowed for the 16th edition, etc. So let's break it down. When we do a periodic inspection, do we do it against the current regs, or do we do it against the regs that we believe the installation was designed and installed to, Dan? What's our first thoughts on that?
They're not retrospective. That's what I have to say. We get this asked quite a lot, don't we, Sam, to be fair? So they're not retrospective. So, and I think that's, when we are looking at installation, you're looking at the time it was installed, obviously, what was in the regulations at the time, So I think the only time you might find a crossover, though, is where you probably got outdoor socket outlets which aren't on an RCD. I think that's probably one. There are a few instances, though, that do carry over, aren't there, from the EICR side of things?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ones that so in general, we definitely do your periodic inspection based on a comparison with the current regs at the time you're doing the inspection. So you don't look back, but you do need to bear in mind. So the one that I always remember is when we introduced CMIN, which effectively says it recognised that the supply voltage could drop, and so we used a value of 95%. That effectively had an impact on all of the ZS values. All of a sudden they were all decreased, so it meant it was tighter, and we had to bear in mind that some of the installs done previously would have been compliant, but because of that change in CMIN, it meant that circuit, that install, was now no longer compliant and would therefore be recorded as such. And if you couldn't achieve the new ZS, it would be potentially recorded as unsatisfactory. So that was one thing to consider. But in general, we do it against current regs. The specific question about no RCD on a lighting circuit, That then it would be seen as in a domestic. Did it say it was in a domestic? Yeah, it did say in a domestic. So so yes, it would be non-compliant with Amendment 2 2022 because RCDs to protect the lighting circuits is a requirement. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's unsafe because generally, and it is quite a generalisation, RCD protections to provide additional protection for the cables, for example, buried in walls. So if we've got adequate fault protection through our breaker or our fuse, then the lack of RCD protection would only be seen as a C3, an improvement recommended to effectively bring the protective arrangements for the circuit in line with current requirements. But providing we've got adequate fault protection so we can meet the ZS of our overcurrent protective device, and we've got a good ZS to all accessible points in the circuit, then the lack of RCD would only be seen as a C3, a recommended improvement.
Same plastic CCUs as well, Sam, isn't it, to be fair? In domestic settings, like plastic CCUs, for example, is another one.
Yeah, there are a few where we would say it's non-compliant with current regulations, but providing there are other things. So, for example, if the plastic consumer unit still provides adequate barrier and enclosure protection, then we would see it as not being something that would warrant an unsatisfactory. And so, yeah, it's a recognition that it's non-compliant, but just because it's non-compliant doesn't mean it's unsatisfactory. There's a note, isn't there, in the beginning introduction to 7671, which talks about the fact that that version may be introducing enhanced safety features that they want to design into and install in all the future installations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all previous installations designed and installed to a previous version are unsafe. You know, it's not the case that they were designed yesterday, they were safe yesterday, they were installed to that specification. We changed the book the next day, and all of a sudden we say those installations are unsafe. That's not the case. So it can't be done like that.
But I think generally, though, you find a lot of it would be just transferred over to comparisons with the current regulations as a CP for that reason, and that's why we would say improvement recommended. It's not saying it's got to be done. It's not saying it's unsafe. It's just saying it's an improvement to bring it up to the current standard because otherwise it would be saying if it was to supersede the new regulations, you'd be saying that all the old regulations would be unsafe, and that's not what it's saying, and that's why it does say the C3 of that improvement recommended. It's just saying you can improve it to bring it up to current standards, basically, but it's not unsafe in its current form, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another one from an engineer, Ronnie Evans. In an industrial installation where there is a parallel supply with an automatic changeover switch for failure of supply for a fire retention system, should you record both ZDB values on the certificate? So yes, our advice would be always that, because effectively where you've got two sources of supply, you're going to have two characteristics, and if your downstream final circuits or distribution boards have got protective devices, they need to be confirmed that they will operate effectively regardless of which of the two supplies and the characteristics that you're going to be supplying them with. So yeah, you know, if it's back at the origin, then we talk about recording two sets of values for all of those characteristics of the two different supplies, just so that then you can conform on. Now this is one of those situations where your standard template of your certificates only caters for one, so you're going to have to come up with a second way, you know, a continuation sheet, some other form to add to it. But yeah, definitely advisable to do it, because then it does so many things. It lets the next person know that you did do that check, which gives them a good feeling about the design and install. But also for anybody making changes to the final circuits or adding something, they can refer back to your supply characteristics to make sure that their new protective device or their new circuit is going to be able to operate correctly and safely. So yeah, very strong recommendation to record both sets of characteristics.
Yeah, I always used to do it on the continuation page, Sam. The first supply, I'll make a note, of the installation cert. Say, please see continuation sheet for additional detail or other supply details. I'll list it on there. It's all about recording it and documenting it on the installation cert. To be fair, you want to capture as much information as possible, because then it also shows that you've done your due diligence and you've checked both sides via that. Basically, you can still meet fault current protection on either side. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got another one. What about on a dual RCD distribution board that has a single insulation on the RCD links? This would need 100 milliamps at the head. Selection is key and keeping tail short as possible. Well, it does depend on, so on a dual RCD board that has single insulation on the RCD links, providing those, that's the manufacturer's instructions, and those links, there's obviously no signs of damage on the links and they're not likely to come into damage. That would still be acceptable without having 100 milliamp at the head. Quite often people think about, if I replace the main switch with an RCD, then I'm doing it well. That would only really protect the cables between the internal cables supplying the final outgoing circuits, and those are parts of the manufacturer's instructions on the board or consumer unit anyway. So that doesn't really do much, providing of course you've got all of your outgoing circuits RCD protected. So yeah, it's not a requirement. Again, if you look at those notes attached to the regulation that we talked about, which is a great regulation because it is one of the longest numbers in the book. One day I'm going to have a look and see if I can find which because there's probably a part 7 regulation which will break it, because they tend to have the part 1 to 6 reg behind the 7. But anyway, so if you look at the notes attached to that reg, it does say that you don't need to put an upfront RCD, providing you meet that, and those notes give informative guidance about making sure that you're following your manufacturer's instructions, and to my mind no manufacturer has ever stated that their board, their consumer unit, can't be used on a TT system because of the internal wiring, but it would, according to those notes, we should get confirmation.
What I would add to that is also, not only when referring to manufacturer instructions, you're also determining that the connections are talked up to the right settings as well. But there are some manufacturers, I can't name them, but on their data sheets, they will often, what they will do, they'll refer to using a split load board, for example, or a TN system, and using an RCBO board referencing only for TTs. And I don't know if that's, I've always wondered if that's always been a get around, to be fair, because in the data sheets, some, not all, they refer to what types of board and what type of earthing systems. So that's always an interesting one. But generally, on the whole, you're right. I've never known any cases of manufacturers to say you can't, but I am aware of one particular manufacturer that only refers to using their dual RCD boards on a TN system as opposed to a TT. So
yeah, no, it's a good point, and it's one of those ones where I think it needs a bit of confirmation and clarification from the manufacturer, but I'm not aware of any big problems. So sometimes it's one of those ones that, although we've got a fear, it's easily comforted by the manufacturers to say, yeah, not an issue, we'll guarantee our internal wiring, our internal cables. But that's why that note specifically says you've got to use the manufacturer's ones. You can't go making your own ones, because they might not have the same rating and therefore the same degree of internal protection. Let's have a look. Someone's mentioned about unless it's beneath a fire escape, so I guess that's where we were talking about our plastic consumer units. If it's in a sole escape route from the building, or under a big means, then it's a consideration, but generally not. And someone's confirmed RCD links will be housed within an enclosure and therefore have additional mechanical protection. No, so it's equivalent to, isn't it? Because they may just be single insulated, but they're within a defined enclosure, which means that they've got equivalent protection, because you've now got to break through two barriers in order to get a full. Okay, we'll pick up one more one, which again is another one that we see quite often when people talk about domestic bathrooms. So another nice simple question, which we have got a good answer for. So, can I fit a 230 volt towel rail at the end of the bath, i.e. it'll be in zone 1, but it's 230 volts? What's our thoughts there, Dan? Can I put a 230 volt towel rail at the end of the bath?
Yes, but you want to start referring to regulation 701.55. And again, this can come back to our trusted manufacturing instructions. So yes, in zone 1, it gives you, and that regulation, a list of idents of equipment that can be installed in zone 1, according to the manufacturing instructions. And I think it's in that 9 is for towel rails. And then if you look a bit further down, it does say though the degree of protection installed in zones 1 and 2, for example, is IPX4. So manufacturing instructions IPX4, and sort of touching on that. I think it's really good. For those that have downloaded the Pocket Guide app, Pocket Guide 1 has got a great little table at the back of it, or in the app now, not on the back of the sheet anymore, on the old hard copies. And he actually gives you like ticks and crosses of what you can install in certain zones as well. And that's always that's a very good high level quick read. The Pocket Guide app, but that Pocket Guide 1 covers that as well. So yes, you can. Plenty of manufacturer instructions, and obviously you've got that IPX4 as well. So.
Yeah, that's great, and it is. There's a few people that are not aware that because there's quite a list of things which you can install in zone 1, even though they're 230. So, and that includes ventilation as well, because that's another one very similar. Can I put a 230 volt fan in zone 1? Well, yes, you can, providing the manufacturer confirms it's suitable for zone 1 and it meets that minimum IP rating. And the app, Dan mentioned the app. Anybody listening tonight or on catch up, if you haven't already downloaded the app, please do. It's a brilliant app. It's a free app. It's got all of what used to be our general pocket guides. It's got links to other industry recognised materials, such as the best practice guides, the previous webinars, and it's got some great little calculations guides there for you as well. So if you want to know what the maximum ZS of one of the common protective devices in there, it will tell you. If you want to know what the resistance of a size cable that you think is over a certain length, again, it will give you an idea of that resistance. So it's an award-winning app that we are very proud of. If you haven't downloaded it already, then please download it. It'd be hopefully you'll find it really, really useful. We've come to the end of another Monday night, so just a few things that I want to tell you about as well. We've got our wire series, our very successful wire series will start up again in September. We had a break for Christmas, but it will be starting again in early September, and I know that some of the subjects being covered are some of the early ones are there's an item on a nice back to basics about earthing and bonding. There's another one about contacting DNOs when installing EV chargers and solar PV, and we've got a very good one about the EICR electrotechnical assessment, so some further guidance on those as a follow-up to one that Dan did earlier in the year. So keep an eye out on social media. You'll get some invites, and very soon the list of webinars for the second half of the year up till Christmas will be available on our website for you to register for. up until then, please do keep in touch. So if you're not signed up, we've got a Facebook account, a Twitter account. I've just seen that we need to replace that symbol. It's not a bird anymore now. Elon's made us an X, hasn't he? So
It's an X.
yeah. So LinkedIn and our YouTube channels. Please do participate in the questions of the week. They're always good. And do everything you can to stay in touch. And lastly, we just wanted to say thank you. So thank you very much for everyone that's taken part tonight, and always appreciated. Some great questions. Thank you very much for putting your question in. Hopefully you got a good answer for it. For those that we didn't get round to, because there was probably about 50% of the questions we just didn't get round to tonight. We will try and pick those up in the next one. We've got another one of these sessions on the first Monday in September, which I believe is the 4th of September. So that won't be too far away when we'll be doing this again. And so hopefully you'll be able to join us then. Any final comments, last words from yourself, Dan?
No, obviously, thanks for having me. It's always good. Always love engaging with people. Watch out for those webinar series. We've got a cracking lineup, and the one that we do on the assessment for those that are already NICRC certified. Just sort of go over really the assessment structure to help prepare for the assessment. Also want to touch on supervision levels and how you determine levels of supervision as well, and a bit more deeper understanding as well in relation to the EAS. So there's some really good informative stuff that and you and the team are doing as well, Sam. So yeah, watch out for those when they appear. Watch them on demand. As I say, use the app; it's great. And just thank you all for your time this evening. I appreciate you all taking time out to watch us ramble on. So thank you. So yeah, have a good evening.
Yep. No, thanks very much, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Take care. See ya.